Good morning, everybody. For those of you who don't know me, I am Cheryl Sandora, and I am a fellow in the ELA department with the Institute for Learning. And I would like to welcome all of you this morning. Our next speaker, Dr. Ron Ferguson, I'm very pleased and honored to introduce him to you. Dr. Ron Ferguson is from Harvard University and is an MIT-trained economist focused on social science research on economic, social, and educational challenges, and is the founder of Tripod, the nation's leading provider of classroom-level survey assessments for K-12 education. He is the faculty co-chair and director of the Achievement Gap Initiative at Harvard University, where he has taught since 1983. And I'm taking these off because this is, you know, when you get old and you don't need them for, and I need them up and down, so it's driving me crazy. Much of Dr. Ferguson's recent research has focused on racial achievement gaps appearing in publications of the National Research Council, excuse me, the Brookings Institution, and the United States Department of Education, in addition to various books and scholarly journals. These include his book, Toward Excellence with Equity, An Emerging Vision for Closing the Achievement Gap. A February 2011 profile of Dr. Ferguson in the New York Times wrote, "There is no one in America who knows more about the gap than Ronald Ferguson." In addition, Dr. Ferguson is the lead author of the recent study from the Achievement Gap Initiative at Harvard University. This study suggests some ways of balancing the nation's emphasis on standardized test scores with other measurable learning outcomes, a key issue that has plagued educators for a number of years and continues to be a challenge for all of us. Today, Dr. Ferguson will share his insights gained from this study as he talks about the influence of teaching beyond standardized test scores, specifically engagement, mindsets, and agency. Dr. Ferguson has described agency as essentially the capacity and propensity to take purposeful initiative. It's the opposite of helplessness, and that's such an important point to remember. We need to recognize that developing agency may be as important an outcome of schooling as the skills we measure with standardized testing. We're excited to hear what additional insight Dr. Ferguson has to share with us concerning this very important and relevant topic. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Ron Ferguson.
Have you calmed down yet and Jeff got you all revved up? Said, now how am I supposed to follow that? Okay, just to tell you a bit about where I'm coming from on this stuff. I grew up in Cleveland, Ohio. My father was a bus driver, my mother was a stay-at-home mother, and we were better off than a lot of the other families around us. So when I was about 8 years old, I asked somebody, what is it you do as a grown-up to make things better for people? And I think the paint was peeling on some houses, and I must have described what I was talking about. And whoever answered me said city planning. So I grew up planning to be a city planner. I got to Cornell University, found myself accidentally in the engineering school, because where I came from in Cleveland, Case Western Reserve has a city planning school and the engineering school. I didn't know about catalogs and all that kind of stuff you're supposed to read up on schools. So I found myself in engineering. I spent 1.5 years in engineering, but then discovered economics. And I figured a lot of things I was interested in were really economics problems, so I decided to major in economics. As an undergraduate, though, I could find nothing in the economics department that was about the neighborhood. So I figured the answers must be in grad school. And so I got myself accepted to the #1 economics department in the world to do a PhD in economics at MIT, and quickly discovered that PhD in economics at MIT was essentially applied mathematics. And even the people who studied urban economics were not interested in my neighborhood. I stayed around and finished because I didn't know what else to do, where else to go. But then I got myself hired at the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard, where it's all about public problem solving. And they don't worry too much about what the tools are. They want rigor, but the tools can come from wherever they need to come from just to be useful. So I started teaching state and local economic development, about how to generate jobs and raise incomes in cities. And started also looking outside of economics for some ideas about what really motivates people and what you need to do. And like Jeff went to Maslow, I went also to motivational psychology and looked at some of the same kinds of ideas about fundamental human motive dimensions to look to when we were trying to figure out how to motivate people and really get folks engaged. But it was at the end of the 1980s when we had access to 10-year-old data from the National Longitudinal Survey of Youth. The National Longitudinal Survey of Youth tested 12,000 kids in 1979 using the Armed Forces Qualifications Test. They tested 14 to 21-year-olds in 1979. So 10 years later, in 1989, we had test scores to look at how those test scores predicted the earnings of 24 to 31-year-olds. Right? So the kids are 10 years later, 10 years older. And what we saw was startling. That you drop a test score in a wage equation and knock out most of the black, white, and most of the hourly, most of the black, white, and most of the Hispanic white hourly earnings gap. So gaps between Latinos and whites, gaps between African Americans and whites were mostly wiped out by test scores. And that was 1989-90. And what it wasn't saying tests are important. What it was saying is that the skills that tests measure are important. And there had actually been a run-up in the market value of reading and math skills from the mid-70s till about till the early 90s. That was a period when the skill gap between racial groups was actually narrowing, but the value of skills was growing so rapidly that the wage gap was rising. Okay? So whereas a 10-point difference in skills might be worth $1 an hour in 1980, a 5-point difference, just cut the gap in skills in half, might be worth $1.50 an hour. Right? So we were falling behind in wages because that skill gap was there and the value of skill was rapidly growing during that period. So as an economist interested in racial equity and socioeconomic equity, it seemed to me at that point there was nothing more important you could do than to close that skill gap, than to give kids the reading and math skills they needed to go in the market and have something to sell to employers. Okay? And we could fight tests all day long, but the tests were measuring some things that actually mattered. And so it was at that point that I started shifting over from doing state and local economic development and things that economists think of as economics to doing things aimed at helping to close the achievement gap, to raise the skill level, starting to do more youth development programming work, more starting the school stuff in the mid-1990s and then on. But we have been very much on test-based accountability for the last 15, 20 years. I don't want to move entirely away from that because those test scores are measuring things that employers pay for. At the same time that we do need to add the socio-emotional stuff. We do need to add the attention to kids being able to manage their emotions and diagnose and read social situations and understand themselves and the way they fit into the world in some of the ways that Jeff was talking about. But it's both and, not either or. Okay, and so then you go into schools. I started trying to do work in schools in late 1990s. And it wasn't that people didn't kind of want to do better. A lot of times they actually didn't know how to do better, right? People were being asked to do things that they had never seen done and are still being asked to do things they've never seen done. And I didn't really see great schools until we did a conference for the Achievement Gap Initiative in 2009 where I was interested in seeing what do the really great schools do? How do they do it? And so I rank ordered schools in Massachusetts by value-added gains. And a lot of people hate value-added, but value-added is looking at the growth in test scores that you can't explain by looking at who the kids are, okay? It takes the growth in test scores that's left over after you've taken into account the previous scores and the things you can measure about who the kids are. And if we want to know what schools produce, that's the way to measure what schools produce. They produce that otherwise unexplainable gain in scores. So you take that, rank order all the schools in the state, and then look at which schools in the state are producing the value-added gains, particularly with diverse student populations. And there are some, and they're not all charter schools. Okay? There's some regular garden variety schools where people have figured out how to get it done. And they've become learning communities. They do it different ways. Their principals have little tricks of the trade. They deal with a lot of stuff that Jeff was talking about, but they also deal with basic everyday pedagogy. And they make it impossible for teachers not to play. Okay? One way or another, everybody's got to play. And these things, you go and they have different ways of handling it. One school actually, Brockton High School, they've got a new principal now. I think they may be trending down a little bit. They're still pretty good. But what they did when they did really well was, and they think they still do this, that every teacher in the building, including the gym teachers, have to give a couple serious writing assignments. They have a building level rubric by which they measure what good quality writing looks like for high school kids. Teachers have to grade those serious writing assignments using the rubric, and then they hand the graded work into their supervisors. And they sit with their supervisors and review the grading. They get feedback on the feedback they gave to the kids. And if they didn't use the rubric well, then the supervisor is going to coach them on how to use it better and try to understand why they didn't use it well. When they were first shifting over to this, there were a lot of teachers who didn't want to do it. It was going to be more work. The football coach said, I teach football, I don't teach writing. They said, did you go to college? Yeah. Did you write papers? Did you learn anything when you wrote papers? Are we supposed to be here teaching kids and helping them to learn things? Are you a teacher? Well, then help me understand why you shouldn't give writing assignments. Okay, so they gave writing assignments on blood pressure and things that are physical, that not unreasonable for a football coach to give writing assignments on. And I said to the associate principal who was responsible for overseeing all this, how did you get folks to do this when they didn't want to do it? I said, there must have been some mighty angry conversations in the hallway. She said, no, perfectly collegial. I said, well, then tell me how you did it. She said, well, there's some little phrases that turned out to be useful. I said, what? And she said, well, help me understand and let me help you. Help me understand and not let me help you, let us help you. So you're telling me you don't want to do this. Help me understand that. And they say something else. Well, help me understand that. Okay, well, you said this a minute ago. Help me understand how that fits with what you just said. And you basically badger them with help me understand. And then when they get to the point where they say, I can't do it, well, let us help you. It's hard for a resistor to get around that, right? And other principals have other ways to do it. But they each have their informal ways to put folks under some pressure to tune in and to be part of the learning community and to grope their way along together, figuring out how to do it. Okay? But they had not seen how to do it before that. They figured it out how. And before we did this project, I'd never seen a school like that. You know, now we tend to, every year, rank order schools, and we call up some schools and say, how'd you do that? You know, one principal said, I don't like to see teachers teaching at their seats. He said, so I walk the hallways. And if I see somebody, the kids doing seat work and the teacher sitting up front, I walk in and I tap the teacher on the shoulder and I say, hey, let's teach something. And we go to the board and we teach together. You know. So all these things. So to make a long story short, my sense of mission in this is to try to make sure people know what it looks like to do the things that they need to do. And it's a matter of getting the emotions right. But when you interview really effective leaders, it's a combination of heart and mind. They are viscerally committed to doing what it takes. They want to understand their kids. They want to connect with their kids. They want to do right by their kids. It's an ethical proposition that you prepare these kids well for school. It's immoral not to do it. They have that sense of it. But they also know what they're looking for. They can describe what they want to see when they look and go into a classroom. And they can talk about when they don't see it, and they aren't willing to, they are not shy about letting somebody know when they don't see it. And it's not in a punitive way. It's, I see some things that I think we could work on in your teaching. Can we talk about it? Can we work together? Okay? And so part of what I'm going to talk to you about today is some ways we've kind of unbundled it to help people just hold it in their heads. And the way we've also looked at how the different components of teaching predict different components of the outcomes that we're trying to produce. Okay? A lot of times you can look at something, but without having a lot of data and being able to parse it, you don't really know what part of what you're doing is creating the results that you're looking for. And so what adults do is they revert to it's all about lines. Okay? And Educators have their own favorite, oh, it's all about, and then they fill in the blank, caring. Or it's all about relationships. It's all about high expectations. I said, no, it's not all about any of those things. It's about a bunch of things, or at least several things that you can hold in your head. We want to talk about those. Okay, so let me just see if we're on. Okay, there are a few little handles here. One is just that we're trying to harvest latent potential. Every one of us, every one of our children has potential that is there just waiting to be harvested. And Robert Schuller had this line that any fool can count the seeds in an apple, like latent, unharvested potential, but only God can count the apples in a seed. And how many apples we get from the seed depends on how effectively we cultivate the seed. This is a poem, Sure as Sunlight. There's a child here in your caring who may someday cure all cancer, but you've got to lay the groundwork so they can come to pass. She's a child who has not blossomed, so you cannot see her brilliance, but as sure as there's sunlight, she's here, now, in your class. I can't tell you what her name is, nor her height, nor weight, nor color, only that she is, potentially, a history-making lass. So we're there just trying to pull this stuff out of our kids. Okay, and we've got to do a lot of stuff Jeff was talking about, really try to understand, differentiate, anchor it in their reality. Okay, there's some, and we also with teachers have to figure out how far we can get them to go. Some of you have heard the book for white teachers who teach in the hood, and the rest of y'all too. Okay, there's some things that are really creative in that book. But it's hard to imagine 80% of white teachers actually doing. Okay, and so we have to give people access to that, and if they can do that, great. But short of that, there's got to be some stuff they can do too. I mean, not everybody's going to sit in a Pentecostal church and learn the cadences of the minister and bring those into the classroom. So, agency, the capacity and propensity to take purposeful action, the opposite of helplessness. It's not a fixed trait. Parents, teachers help to inspire, enable, and focus it by the opportunities and guidance they provide. So we want to get our kids in a mindset so they have the propensity and the ability, the capacity to take purposeful action, to be in charge of their lives, not to be like a feather in the wind or blown around. And we can see here, I mean, I think each of us can identify a few relatives whose basic skills are okay, who are pretty articulate, but who just don't do what they need to do. They're lacking some executive function skills that don't have a sense of agency. And so we want to make sure that people have those basic reading and math skills, the stuff that test scores measure, but we also want to work on the rest of it. And so it's not either or, it's both and. So we've got the things on the left, things that you can test, reading skills, math skills, reasoning skills, academic knowledge, but then there are those untested things that we measure with surveys. School engagement, growth mindset, conscientiousness, future orientation, various success skills and mindsets. And what we're going to talk about is how the components of teaching predict the stuff in the orange box over there. So how does teaching quality affect these agency-related factors, and what are some implications? What we measure teaching quality is what we call the tripod 7 C's. I started surveying schools in the late 1990s. I was working with the minorities, first Shaker Heights, Ohio, so we first started developing these classroom level surveys. That spread into the Minority Student Achievement Network. Most recently, the Tripod 7 C's were the student voice piece of the Gates Foundation MET project, the project on measures of effective teaching, where we brought in both what students said about how they experienced teaching in the classroom, what expert observers observed in the classroom using several different rubrics, and standardized test score gains. And we looked at how those various measures cross-validate each other. And the 7 C's measures were the most stable, reliable within teacher. So if you look at 2 different classrooms taught by the same teacher and look at correlations between the classrooms, if you look at standardized test score gains, there's about a 0.2 to 0.4 correlation within teacher across classrooms. If you look at the expert observations, like using the Danielson rubric, for example, there's about a 0.4 correlation within teacher across classrooms. If you look at how students assess instruction, this is like the classroom composite of how students assessed instruction. It's like a 0.6 or 0.7 correlation between classrooms. And it stands to reasons with kids, you got 20 people there every day observing teaching. And they answer questions about the nature of the instruction they observe. But even if you've got a few knuckleheads, that gets balanced out by the other kids and the central tendencies in the classroom. And so it turns out to be pretty stable and also pretty precise with regard to the distinctions you can make. And that's part of what I want to tell you about here. The 7 C's, the first 2 are care and confer, which I refer to as interpersonal support. This is the relationship piece of it that's more purely relational. So for example, my teacher seems to know if something's bothering me. Teacher's tuned in. My teacher in this class makes me feel that she really cares about me. Confer, my teacher gives us time to explain our ideas. My teacher wants us to share our thoughts. It's basically that communication that the teacher is inviting, that interaction. So these are the first 2 of the C's. I should say the report that pretty much everything I'm talking about today comes off of the report, The Influence of Teaching. If you go to the Achievement Gap Initiative website, agi.harvard.edu, you look on the home page, this report is posted there, or at least the face of it. You click on that, you can download the report. So it's got way more than I'm going to tell you today, but it's got pretty much everything I'm going to tell you today in here. So those are the first 2 of the C's. Then we get curricular support that's linked to the curriculum. And here we have captivate, which is making interesting and relevant. Teacher makes lessons interesting, or the negative one is this class does not keep my attention, I get bored. So obviously we want kids to disagree with that. Clarify, my teacher explains difficult lessons clearly. Comments I get on assignments help me understand. If you don't understand, my teacher explains it another way. So it's clarify. Consolidate is about summarizing, tying it all together, and making it all coherent. And so captivate, clarify, and consolidate are all about delivery of the curriculum and supporting kids in learning the curriculum. Then press is about getting kids to get outside their comfort zone a little bit, doing stuff they don't always want to do. And so here we're talking about challenge. And with, well, I'll get to a minute. My teacher asks students to explain more about the answers they give. That's challenge for rigor. Teacher doesn't let students give up when the work gets hard. That's challenge for persistence. Accepts nothing less than our best effort. That's challenge for persistence. It's interesting. We recently, in one teacher I was talking to, she got very different response patterns for these 2 here. My teacher doesn't let students give up when the work gets hard. My teacher accepts nothing less than our best effort. Most of the time, people get very similar response patterns for those 2. And the teacher was saying, there must be something wrong with the survey. This is almost the same question, and the students are answering very differently. But if you look at the details of what these questions are asking, one's about the floor and one's about the ceiling. My teacher doesn't let people give up when the work gets hard. That's about what you do when the work is hard, giving up. That's not the same question as whether she accepts nothing less than your best effort. If you've got a B student who's kind of floating around, not working really hard, they're not giving up, they're doing okay. But if the teacher accepts nothing less than their best effort, and the teacher knows they could do a lot better, then she's giving you a hard time, even though you're getting B's. You know, you can do better than this. Take this paper, write it over again. Okay. Classroom management, our class stays busy, doesn't waste time. Students in this class treat the teacher with respect. And so we end up with these 7 ideas, 5 of which are support, 2 of which are about challenge. Okay? And a lot of people, if you just look at those and think about the teacher's mindset when they're doing these things, it can feel like it's all about relationships. But when you unbundle it, and everything is being done through relationships, but through those relationships, when you're conferring with students, it can be in service to any of these other things. Or when you're clarifying something, that's a slightly different activity than when you're challenging a student. Okay? And you're clarifying because you care, you've connected with the student, you don't want them to leave confused, so you're doing the work to clarify. But that's a different activity than when you're saying, you gave up too soon. Here, go do some more, work harder on it. Or why do you think what you're thinking? One of the items on challenge is my teacher wants us to understand the material, not just memorize it. Right? So when you unbundle clarify, we have actually 3 little dimensions of clarify. Lucid explanations, explaining things really clearly. Informative feedback, giving kids, don't give them the answer, but give them some scaffold it in the feedback. And then clearing up confusion, where you just might go in and just tell them the answer but ultimately clear up confusion. So those are 3 different dimensions that we estimate the effect of separately. And then a challenge is both challenge for rigor and challenge for persistence. So there are actually 10 things here that we can distinguish. We've got millions of data points because we've surveyed in more than 35 states around the country for a while. So we can do a lot. This study here is based on a sample of about 16,000 classrooms with kids ages with 6th grade through 9th grade. But the basic patterns are general. They're not going to be restricted to those grades. So what I want to, here, the things we're going to predict, some are engagement goals that relate to agency. So this scaffolding here, I gotta watch my time. This scaffolding here is based on Erikson's first 5 stages of identity development. Okay, and it's what happens in a relationship over time. In Erikson, it was a relationship between the human being and the social environment. Here, it's a relationship between a person and the classroom environment. So trust versus mistrust, we measure happiness and anger. You know, like this class is a happy place to be, or being in this class makes me feel angry, those kinds of things. And we see that trust versus mistrust, that has to do with the emotions that inspire agency, that inspire purposeful action, for example. Cooperation versus misbehavior are behaviors that express agency. And so punctuality, trying to get to class on time, behaving yourself, being cooperative. Ambitiousness versus ambivalence are motivations that help to focus that agency. So mastery orientation, in other words, having the orientation to really want to learn things thoroughly. We have measures of performance orientation. We didn't actually use those in this particular context. But the sense of efficacy is not exactly a motivation, but if kids have no sense of efficacy, they know I just can't do this, then it's going to be hard for them to be motivated to be ambitious. Okay? It's almost irrational to be highly ambitious to do something that you know you can't do. Okay? Diligence versus disengagement, behaviors that express agency, effort, help-seeking. And we have some things that are opposite of that, like disengagement. In this class, I give up when the work gets hard. Those kinds of things. And then satisfaction versus disappointment. Again, emotions that inspire agency. Satisfaction with how well you've done in the class. I'm satisfied with what I've done in this class, for example. And then we have some success skills and mindsets, things like conscientiousness that expresses agency, academic skills that enable agency, growth mindset that inspires it in a way, and future orientation, just being conscious that what you're doing today is setting you up for what's going to happen in the future, being aware of the future. So we have survey-based measures of all those things I just listed. And for all those things I just listed, we can look at how between classroom measures of the 7 C's predict these things. And that's going to show you the results of it in a second. And the way we set the statistical analysis up is pretty complicated because it's like four levels in it. You've got the difference between a student and their classmates. You've got a difference between each kid and their classmate. Then you have the difference between their class and the average class in the school. Then you have the difference between that school and the average school in the district. And then you have the difference between the district and other districts in our sample. Okay? And here, the results I'm going to show you come off the piece of that's the difference between their classroom and other classrooms in the school. And the way I set it up is I take for each individual student, I pull out what they said about their conscientiousness, their growth mindset, or engagement on these various dimensions. I take what they said about these things, then I put together a classroom measure that throws out what they said about the classroom. So I'm only using what their classmates said about the classroom. Okay, so I'm predicting what an individual said about their own mindsets and engagement using what their classmates said about instruction in that classroom. And I'm doing that for every kid, in this case, really about 8,000 of those 16,000 classrooms, is what I'm going to show you. Okay? So I can tease, with this much data, I can tease out all kinds of nuance in this. And exactly what combination of those 7 C's predicts each of these pieces. And there's a ton of nuance that I'm going to go through now and show you. So how does teaching quality predict those agency-related factors? And what I want to do is make it a little bit of a game. We don't have a whole lot of time to do it. But here you see engagement goal 1 is trust versus mistrust. We want students to feel comfortable and happy and trustful and safe in the classroom. And the question is, for example, if we look at the 7 C's and these subcategories of clarify and challenge, which of the 2 or 3 do we think are most important for predicting happiness in class? If you had to guess, just give you a chance to think about that, and then I'll show you on the next slide. You think captivate? Is that important? All right. Yeah. Classroom management? For care? Okay, how about anger? What predicts whether kids are angry in class? Okay. And what I'll show you, you'll see, what we're going to see is that there's a bar chart, and the length of the bar is the size of the effect. And for each of these, I ran this thing separately for students with A range grade point averages, B range grade point averages, and C range grade point averages. Okay? And so you'll be able to see whether the effects are different depending upon what kind of student people are, whether they're higher or lower achievers. And here in the C's, including C or lower. So the C's are C, kids who get C's or lower. And so this is what it looks like. For happy in class, most people, I heard a lot of cares and captivate. Okay? So for whether kids are happy in class, it's most strongly predicted by care and captivate. I also heard a little classroom management. That's in there a little bit too. Right? But notice the stuff that's got to do with the basic, clarify and challenge. Slightly negative there, but really nothing to speak of. So clarify and challenge are not really predicting too much whether kids are happy in class. It's really, is it interesting, and does I connect with my teacher? Connect with my teacher in an emotional way. She really sees me as an individual, cares about me, and she's making this pretty interesting. So this is a happy place to come. Someplace I want to come back here. Okay. Angry, on the other hand, care is not feeding into anger very much. It's clear up confusion and captivate. It's boring and I'm confused. Okay? So kids are most angry when they're bored and confused. Okay? It makes sense, right? Okay, I'm sitting here, I don't have a clue what you're talking about. Pardon? And I'm bored out of my mind. So those are the 2 things here. And if you go through, just watch the nuance, and it all makes sense. Okay? But I told you, I guess that maybe I didn't tell you, the strongest predictors of year-to-year learning gains are challenge and classroom management. Okay? Now, it may be that some of the other C's enable you to challenge. I don't care what you know till I know that you care. I mean, I'm not denying that. But the caring doesn't produce much after you've taken challenge and classroom management into account. Okay? You actually got to push students to work, to stay on task, to think hard, to persist in the face of difficulty. Okay? And clarify, it turns out, is a strong supporter of those too. So if you get clarify, challenge, and classroom management, you got a lot of what's predicting annual learning gains. Kids can hate you as a teacher, but if you can get them to sit there and learn and concentrate, they can still learn it with really low on care, even. Okay. Now, next one is cooperation versus misbehavior. So you have whether kids want to get to class on time and try to get to class on time, whether they behave themselves. Now, obviously, classroom management is going to be a strong predictor of that. But what else other than classroom management is going to predict punctuality and good conduct? Captivate, okay. I'm going to rush it on a little, time is a little short, otherwise we could draw this out. Punctual to class, challenge. You got basically a teacher who's serious, who's challenging kids to think rigorously and to persist. Classroom management is not coming in on punctual. We get a little bit of captivate, somebody said captivate, and we get negative on confer. Questions, what's happening with that? I think what's happening with that, you're going to see negative on confer in several cases. This analysis is for each of the C's, it's looking at the effect of the C's holding everything else constant. So if you're holding everything else constant, what are you conferring about? There's not much left to confer about. It's probably idle chatter. Okay? And after you've held everything else constant, the negative on confer is probably picking up the teacher who stands at the door for the first 5 or 10 minutes and just chats with kids when they're coming in. Because some people like to check in, like to schmooze a little bit to build a relationship. But if the kids know you're just going to BS for 5 minutes, they can just take their time to get to class. That's probably what's going on with that confer piece. Over here, good conduct in class, both care and confer coming in negative. And we looked more deeply into that because a lot of times we survey the kids and the teachers about the same class. So we can look to see what do teachers say about their own class. So for those teachers who the kids rate high on care, what do they say about their own classes? For the teachers who the kids rate low on care, what do they say about their classes? And we look at that, and we spell it out more in the report. It's totally there. You can see it clearly. What happens is the teachers who are rated higher on care tend to stand at the door and talk informally with students. They tend to spend time talking to kids about what happened to your baseball game last night and those kinds of things. They are not strict, and they don't think of themselves as strict. They don't report themselves as being strict the way that some other teachers do. They don't report themselves as demanding students get to class on time. They are more sensitive. They're more likely to take effort into account when they do grading. They do a number of things that are more aimed at building rapport with kids. But when teachers build a lot of rapport, think about the reason some kids behave in class is they're just a little bit afraid of the teacher. The teachers who are rated highest on care, the kids aren't afraid of them. So the class is just a little bit more disorderly. And a lot of teachers might say, that's fine, I will accept the disorder in exchange for that stronger relationship. But it looks like there is a little bit more disorder in the classrooms of those teachers who really do build rapport. And I suspect with a lot of those teachers, that's just fine. Right? So keep going. Mastery orientation. This is mastery orientation as a student saying, I really want to master my studies in here. I really want to learn what we're trying to get done here. And then efficacy, whether they think they can do it or not. Anybody want at least one guess on what's most important for mastery orientation? Somebody said challenge. Can somebody say something a couple times? I can't hear you. Persistence. Okay, so that's probably a challenge too. So let's see. Strongest is lucid explanations and require rigor and require persistence are the strongest there on mastery orientation. So if my teacher explains things really clearly, if I really want to understand it, I can probably actually understand it if she's explaining things really clearly. And then requiring rigor and requiring persistence. Clear up confusion is not contributing. Confer is cutting negative. Okay? And again, I think it's because holding everything else constant, the confer tends to be idle chatter. It tends to be a little off task. I mean, sometimes ideologically, we just say, we want student voice. We want to talk to students. We want to interact with our students. Well, it's got to be about something. Okay? Efficacy, clear up confusion, lucid explanations, require persistence. Oh, and captivate. So kids think, I can do this if they've got a teacher who's making it interesting, who's clearing up confusion, explaining things clearly, and requiring them to persist. Keep going. Effort. Captivate, lucid explanations, and persistence. A little negative on clear up confusion, a little negative on confer. Help seeking, care, and all the clarify stuff. Okay? Does a student say, if I need help from this teacher, I ask for it? If you've got a teacher who is receptive, like caring, is just, I'm not afraid of this teacher, and clear up confusion, those are exactly the things that should predict help seeking. Right? And so if we've got teachers who are teaching things where they're not very good at clarify, then the kids are going to say it's futile to ask for help. Disengagement. This is kids like giving up when the work gets hard and then hiding effort. Here, you see disengagement is a little higher with care and confer, lower with if it's interesting, lower if the teacher's good at clearing up confusion. Lower if the teacher is good at challenge. And then this is the one place where I put peers tease for making mistakes. But this is where peers teach for making mistakes is really strong. If the kids are in a classroom where the kids are teasing kids for making mistakes, then you've got more disengagement. Also, I didn't show on hiding effort. Oh yeah, here it is. Hiding effort. Teasing for making mistakes. And that is almost the only thing that's in there. Okay? If there's teasing for making mistakes, kids don't want to be the target, so just be quiet, hang back. Just pretend like you don't care. We have an item is sometimes in this class I pretend I'm not working hard even when I really am. Okay, sometimes I hold back from doing my best because of what other people might say or think. Satisfaction with what you've learned. Captivate and lucid explanations, and then some informative feedback. Perceived learning. How much kids think they learned? We learned a lot in this class almost every day, for example. Consolidate and lucid explanations. You learn a lot in this class almost every day because consolidate, you told them what they learned. You called time out 5 minutes before the class was over. You said, okay, let's go over what we talked about today. Let's relate it to what we talked about last time, what we're going to talk about next time. You pull it together, then they know they learned something. And some recent analysis we've done for secondary schools show that consolidate is also a strong predictor of annual learning gains, where it's not so much for elementary, but the secondary schools taking the time to pull it together actually does help the memory. We get care, develop conscientiousness. Everything helps with conscientiousness. Classroom management and required persistence help the most, except clear up confusion. Because if a teacher jumps in and clears up confusion too quickly, you robbed kids of the opportunity to struggle through it. Right? And so develop future orientation, care, and captivate are the strongest, and some require rigor and lucid explanations. Future orientations, my teacher in this class inspires me to want to go to college. Or because of my teacher in this class, I think more about what I'm going to do after high school. Okay? And so here, care and captivate, you may remember, are also the strongest predictors of happiness. So the things that most strongly predict happiness also most strongly predict future orientation and hope and aspiration and optimism about the future. Those are different from what predicts annual learning gains. It's easy to be a teacher in a classroom. You've got a good relationship with your students. You're making it interesting. They're engaged. They think it's relevant. You say everything is going good. But they may not be learning much at all. You may not be getting those learning gains. To get the learning gains, you also need to challenge them working at the margin of their skills to persist through learning it and staying on task. First thing I ever learned in the field of education was high quality time on task. You got to put in the time, it needs to have some quality to it, and then you get the learning done. So you can have great relationships and zero learning going on. Everybody's happy, everything. In a school, principals are happy if there's nobody's griping about anything, but you're dead in the water. You've got to have the challenge, and you need to have the time on task in order to get it done. And there's some relationship foundation. If kids are traumatized, it's hard to challenge them and effectively get them to come in. So you've got to deal with the trauma first stuff. You've got to start with those bottom two rungs of Maslow, like Jeff was saying. But for the majority of our students, that's not where they're stuck. For the majority of our students, it's just, I don't understand this, or I don't feel motivated to learn it. And we've got to get all the C's. All the C's matter because they're each important somewhere for something different. And again, there's tremendous nuance here. A growth mindset, everything, clear up confusion hits negative on growth mindset. And it's not that you don't want to ultimately clear up confusion, you just don't want to do it too quickly. You want to give some informative feedback and explain things clearly, and then let them work through the confusion to get it cleared up. And then we get challenge in classroom management, and everything is coming in for growth mindset. Just good teaching across the board is helping with this. So here, if you extract from what I said all the implications for teaching. Here we got, for care, be attentive and sensitive, but avoid a tendency among sensitive teachers to coddle students in ways that hold them the lower standards and undermine their agency. Encourage and respect students' perspectives and honor student voice, but also stay focused on instructional goals. Avoid extended discussions that have no apparent purpose and thereby fail to model self-discipline and effective agency. Go back. Captivate. Strive to make lessons stimulating and relevant to the development of agency. If some students seem unresponsive, do not assume they're disinterested. Some students, and especially those who struggle, purposefully hide their interest and their effort. Consolidate. Regularly summarize and check for understanding because consolidation helps solidify learning and models your agency as a teacher even when students seem reticent or disinterested. Clarify. Clarify by clearing up confusion. Take regular steps to detect and respond to confusion in class, but in ways that share responsibility with students for doing the thinking. So don't jump in there and just clear it up. Give some informative feedback, some scaffolding. Clarify with lucid explanations. Strive to develop clear explanations, especially for the material the students find most difficult, including lucid examples of how the skills and knowledge you teach can support effective agency. So what can you do with what I'm teaching you here? Clarify with instructive feedback, give instructive feedback, and help scaffold student agency in correcting their own work and building their own understandings. Challenge. Challenge by requiring rigor. Press students to think deeply instead of superficially about their lessons. Set and enforce performance goals that require students to use reasoning and exercise agency in the learning. Challenge by requiring persistence. Consistently require students to keep trying even when the work is difficult, to give their best efforts and produce their best work, knowing that few things could be more important for developing agency. Classroom management. Strive to achieve respectful, orderly, on-task student behavior in your class by teaching in ways that clarify, captivate, and challenge, instead of imposing control by intimidation and coercion. Okay? If you look at what predicts an orderly, on-task, respectful classroom, you can intimidate kids into submission, and they'll be very well behaved, but they won't be engaged. Okay? Clarify, captivate, and challenge help predict, and I showed you help predict an orderly classroom. Now, some people can say, well, what's the relationship between what you said and cultural responsiveness? Okay, you could take what Jeff talked about earlier today and say, well, Jeff said cultural responsiveness was important, and Ferguson said the 7 C's are important. I don't know what to think now. There's no conflict between what I'm saying and what Jeff said. Okay, there's a difference in emphasis. But here I took the C's and I just gave you a culturally responsive or culturally competent framing of each one of those. So care, I express caring to every student, being especially sure not to either neglect or coddle students from any racial, ethnic, or social class background. I try to be self-conscious of my biases and avoid allowing them to affect my interactions with students. Okay, so that's caring in a culturally sensitive way. Confer, I elicit and value the classroom contributions of students from all backgrounds. Essentially, it's confer. Captivate, I make an effort to use curriculum materials and to design lessons that will be interesting, relevant, and motivating to students from a variety of backgrounds. Make a special effort to pay homage in my lessons and curriculum to the contributions of people from the groups represented in my class and to help students find meaning and purpose. So who's in my class? Who are they? How do I help them find meaning and purpose in the context of the communities they come from? One little nugget on this. Kids who coming from less advantaged backgrounds suffer a sellout guilt and a survivor's guilt when they start to really believe they can move up to a middle class level. It's like, I don't deserve this. My friends and family never had it. And anyway, we decided we don't want to be like those people anyway. And so I'm actually trying to be like them. And I'm trying to go there. I don't deserve it, and it's just not right. And then they self-sabotage. They shoot themselves in the foot. Okay, the way to help them get past that is to help them understand if they put themselves in the best position in terms of their own achievement, they put themselves in the best position to give back. Okay, there are things your community needs that you're going to be in a better position, and your family needs, that you'll be in a better position to survive, to work on, if you rise as high as you can rise, with that consciousness in mind. And then they can give themselves permission to succeed, because it's not selfish anymore. It's toward a grander purpose. And I learned that. We studied a program for high school dropouts and saw kids sabotaging themselves until they could make sense of this. Clarify. I try to scaffold and differentiate instruction in ways that meet the needs of students at different skill levels. I work hard to understand and respond to any systematic patterns of misunderstanding characteristics of students who've had particular life experiences. Consolidate. Help my students build integrated understandings of material, conscious of the fact that they're building their own individual identities and life strategies. I help them integrate our lessons with their own ideas so that they come away with more complete and coherent understandings of their current and future selves and the contributions they may make to their families, community, and society. Challenge. I challenge all students to think rigorously and persist in the face of difficulty. I don't give up on anyone, and I don't let anyone give up on themselves. I try to classroom management. I try to understand students' interpretations of the actions I take for classroom management, and I use disciplinary practices that fit and make sense to students. Okay, so there's no conflict between the culturally focused stuff and the stuff I've talked about, but it's just unbundling it. I run a 5-day summer institute on the achievement gap, and I have a pre-survey that I do that includes asking people why hasn't their community made more progress. And the #1 reason that always ranks is people are overwhelmed by the complexity. They are overwhelmed by the complexity. Even in this workshop, every one of us who speaks is going to have a different framework, a different way of thinking of it. At the end of each day, your head's exploding, your eyes are glazing over. Okay? And so the challenge is to go into any particular community you're trying to work in and develop a common language, a common way of talking about things, boil it down so people don't get lost in it, have each person be able to identify their roles and have some sense of what it would look like to actually do that role. Only have a very small group of people who are responsible for understanding the big picture deeply, because everybody's not going to understand it and doesn't have time, don't want to, and may not have the capacity to. You just want a few people who are the right people to understand the whole thing deeply, to help structure the work for everybody else. Then you need celebrations in combination with accountability. You know, so happy you did that and how well you did that, but I also noticed you haven't made any progress yet. Can we make some progress now? Can you help me understand why we haven't made any progress on this? Okay? And usually it takes some courage to point it out. Okay? But in most cases, there's somebody who's not getting it done and they're a bottleneck. And we've got to be able to deal with that by offering help. And ultimately, if they can't do it with help, moving them out of that slot, putting somebody in that slot who can get the work done. Right? So we give this data back to schools. We give a report. We tell every teacher how they compare to our national sample on each of the C's. People can figure out what they want to work on. For every item, we tell them how they compare to the national sample. We also give them the exact breakdown. They can look in and see how they work on stuff. There's some stuff in here I won't get to now. Time is up. But just examples, and I think I'll probably leave the PowerPoint. They can post it, and you can look through it more leisurely. These are examples of teachers. What did you learn from the student feedback? Learned that some of my own personal challenges manifest themselves in my classroom, and therefore, this is a guy who's kind of lazy and not disorganized, and it showed up in his classroom stuff. When you ask him, well, what did you do differently? He took the survey, but didn't really have much follow-through. So he's still lazy and disorganized. What difference did it make? What difference did it make? Well, there's always next year. But then there are others who actually learned something. There was a certain score that was lower than they wanted it to be, and they worked on it, and so on. This teacher here, I was confirmed in some of my assessment, but surprised in other parts. I knew I needed to work on consolidating, for example, but was surprised I was weak on clarify. Felt sure that was the area where I was strong. I always prided myself in explaining things in a lot of different ways. I knew I would be high on challenge, but I thought I'd be much lower on care than I was. Kids see me as softer than I see myself. This teacher, I went to work on consolidating. I gave more exit slips, summarizers, tickets to leave. I saw how clarifying it is for me. I can measure better whether the learning objective was reached or not. The kids feel better. Oh, I actually did learn something today. I laid off judging myself so much for being too hard on the kids. Maybe I'm not so cold after all. The clarity is the hardest. I think I'm more lost there than I like to admit. And then they go on and talk about what difference it had made and so on. So there's other stuff in the file. But bottom line on this is that there are distinctions between components of teaching. All 10 of those things, it's the 7 C's, the 3 sub-pieces of clarify, the 2 sub-pieces of challenge, each of them is important. It's somewhere. It's some of the outcomes that we care about in class. If educators are interested in having classrooms where students are engaged, where students are developing these mindsets, they need to master the teaching components that feed into those things. And it's true, relationships are important, caring is important. We do all this work through relationships. If a teacher doesn't care, they often won't work hard enough to actually make these things happen. But you can be the nicest, most caring, most loving person in the world, but if you don't know your craft, if you can't clarify, if you don't know how to challenge students, if you don't know how to keep them on task, there's not going to be a whole lot of learning. If you don't know how to make it interesting, there's also not going to be much inspiration in your classroom. So we need to get all these things done, and I'm going to stop because I'm a minute or two over time. All right, so thank you.